just have a conversation. But yeah, just pull that a little bit in, and we'll get it going there.
Sure.
And yeah, so thank you so much for coming and hanging out.
My pleasure.
So where have we left off? Where have we? Where? I mean, where are you from originally? Let's get into it, and then we'll pull ourselves up to like Men on the Run.
I was born in Seoul, South Korea. I moved to the United States when I was 6. Moved to Northern California. Grew up in Northern California, and then moved to New York for university, and spent 20 years out there. Graduated school, and then decided to work in film and television. And we met, I think, mid 2010s when I was making The Wonder List with Bill Weir for CNN original series.
That's right, The Wonder List with Bill Weir. What happened to that show?
We did 3 seasons, and then the network, pivoted towards kind of domestic coverage once Donald Trump became president, as you might imagine.
Yeah.
And they brought it back for a few episodes. I think when was that? 2021, I want to say. And I went back out and we filmed an episode in Montana, and that was to be for the CNN Plus app that had been in development for a while, but that flamed out spectacularly.
The CNN Plus launch was almost as good as the Quibi launch, wasn't it?
Wasn't so many parallels
and so much promise.
Oh my god!
Like
yeah.
I remember, like Jeffrey Katzenberg, like Quibi is going to be the thing, like high quality, 5 minutes, Game of Thrones, HBO style content, and then flamed out.
Money always runs out,
Oh man!
But I'm not even sure what happened to the other episodes we shot for the Wonder List. They're pretty good. It was all during COVID, so
they never even came out.
I've seen them, and like if you go to Max, you can find the first 3 seasons that we made.
Yeah.
But the new season's not on there, so I'm not sure if they're gonna release them at any point. But it'd be great for the world to see it.
Your hard work. Okay, so you grew up in South Korea. You come over. You go to school in the United States. Did you go to film school or anything like that?
No. I studied international relations, foreign policy in college.
Me too. How's it work? How's it working out for you?
Pretty good, to be honest. Most of my work's international, just like you.
Sure.
And I worked at a law firm after I graduated, just because 9/11 happened my senior year of college, so it was a tough time to kind of find a job. I think all of us were kind of struggling at that time. What are we going to do? What are we going to?
2001. Yeah, I think I graduated in 2001 too.
Graduated in 2002, so I was like beginning of senior year.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of my friends went to like law school, and that was something I considered for a bit, but I ended up just going to get a job at a law firm instead, see what that's like, and it was miserable. So I was lucky enough to actually get a good job after that, working for an independent film company called This Is That, which is no longer in existence, but it was run by some very, very talented film producers.
So what's the pitch? What's the pitch going from a law firm to a production house in New York City? Because how did you make that? How did you make that leap?
The position at the film company was director of operations / like office manager. It's a small company. It's like 9 people, so just kind of running the business. And
I didn't mean to hold you back, but you can put on the headphones if you like. I don't know. No, it's all good. Some people like them, some people don't.
No, you got nice audio in here.
Thank you.
Yeah,
thank
you. So it was more like a business end role. So I had a lot of experience in business, up to for a 22-year-old kid. So
yeah,
but also it was a company that made a lot of films I was familiar with, and that motivated me to kind of put my best foot forward, and I was really eager to get my foot in the door and kind of hit it off with the people that ran the place, and yeah, stroke of luck.
That's awesome, because I think most people, I think your story, and we'll get into where you are today, but I think the story of how someone like you comes through the production company creative industry process is really interesting, because most people think like if you don't go to NYU you're screwed.
Yeah, or do internships. Unpaid internships were the whole fad back then.
Yeah,
I've
still
never,
is.
Yeah, I've never had an internship in my life.
Yeah,
I always worked or was in school. But film was a big passion of mine growing up. Like I grew up in a small town in California after I moved here. So not a lot of things to do. So my friends and I would always go to the movies, and I would always watch movies with my family, indie movies too. There's big boom in the '90s for independent features. So it was really exciting to kind of learn what that was all about. The company, this that had made, they had made Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind,
Beautiful.
21 Grams,
Yeah.
The Ice Storm. Ang Lee had an office next door, so it was really exciting to kind of be exposed to that kind of environment. And also at that point, I had no idea what like a producer did. So to kind of learn firsthand from these people who are such experts in the field, yeah, it was a great opportunity, and that's where it kind of all started.
That's amazing. And I got to meet you. Yeah, I think it was like it was 2000, maybe 15 or 16,
Yeah, I think that
somewhere.
sounds about right.
Because I do remember like it might have been actually like November 2016 when the election happened. Because I was in New York
Oof.
for an Explorers Club event, and I think you were there. And I was there. I was out with some friends, like because everyone didn't know what was really going to happen, or they thought something was going to happen, and then the opposite happened. Um, but I think that might have been the time. Yeah, I was there, like 2015, 2016.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, the
it's,
election itself, I was in Miami. And, I mean, we don't have to
we don't have to get into it.
get into
We can relive it again in a couple
yeah.
months.
Oh my God.
But yeah, we try not to get too deep into politics
Yeah.
on this
That's
one.
it.
So you went from so you went from a small production company to working doing CNN originals with Bill Weir. So what's the gap in there that we're all missing? Because how do you go like that's a huge gap. And obviously this was back when CNN was like leading, the world in making high quality
The good old
content
days.
with Bourdain and the whole spiel, right? This was
Yeah.
this was it.
Yeah, we were the first in-house original series, and I believe the second series after the Bourdain show, which they purchased from ZPZ. But I worked at This Is That for about a year and a half, and the more I was exposed to that world, the more I wanted to kind of get my hands dirty and get involved in production.
Mhm.
So I left to actually make a project with a friend of mine from college, who was also kind of parallel paths, and he had
Not a lawyer.
not a lawyer.
I had one friend that wasn't a lawyer, and I
Oh,
just
man.
grabbed him, and we had to do something creative.
That's exactly right.
That's how it works. Like you know what it ends up being? It ends up being people who just aren't working full time. Like if someone's not working full time, they're going to have energy on a Saturday to create something with me somehow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or someone that just doesn't want to be behind a desk, like that's one of like I had two things I wanted for my life: not to be behind a desk, and just to, like make something. Like I don't want to like work in the theoretical. I don't want to work in like law or finance or some other stuff where like you're putting all of the time you have, and then what do you have to show for it? It's all just like make believe, right?
And numbers and other people's problems.
Yeah.
We have enough problems as it is. Okay, so you work, you get a great gig with CNN doing, um, yeah, that incredible show with Bill Weir, right?
Yeah.
And which was incredible. I remember watching that. Like that and Parts Unknown were I think my two favorites. And then they went like all Hollywood, right? And then
Oh.
it's been a bit struggling since then.
Well, I think what they did was they kind of shifted to this model of like this little nice little panel you have here with all the windows,
Yeah, yeah.
except all the talking heads in the studio somewhere talking about Donald Trump 24 hours a day, and that only gets you so far. Prior to that, there was a lot of investment in original content and long form programming, which was exciting at
Yeah.
the time. But then the focus shifts as the winds do.
Yeah.
That's when I decided that really wasn't for me. I left.
So you were lucky to get out before COVID. I mean,
Yeah.
like how did so walk me through like your last episode of Wonderlist with Bill Weir on CNN, and then what happened after, and then what happened with COVID, because you and I was doing those COVID calls when I
Yeah.
got stuck. I was filming in Ethiopia.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, I'll get into my story at some
Yeah.
stage. Still
Please do.
traumatized, but I was filming in the Simeon Mountains in Ethiopia
Yeah.
in mid-March when the world closed. And I was a resident of Dubai. I couldn't go back to Dubai. Then I could have come back to Canada because that's where my passport is, but I didn't want to go back to Canada. And I ended up in Istanbul, Turkey for
I
4
remember you
months.
saying that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And I was bored out of my mind. And I just started like having chats with all my friends, and reconnecting with you. And that was kind of like I guess one of the last kind of things we talked about. But
Yeah.
what were those years between CNN and what happened during COVID?
Well, so after Trump became president. I believe the third season of The Wonderlist had just aired, and word came on that down that they weren't going to make a fourth season. So we were kind of evaluating what we were going to do, and then they commissioned a documentary for us. So Bill and I went out to the field, and we journeyed all across the Midwest, kind of interviewing Trump voters, talking about why all these people voted for Trump. We're in Wisconsin, Oklahoma, all these places that Bill had grown up because he was kind of a latchkey kid, traveling around the South and the Bible Belt. So revisiting those places and also like exploring kind of the 60s and civil rights era and how that contributed to the environment we found ourselves in at the time.
What was that called again?
That was called States of Change Homecoming. And
Oh,
it was actually
I remember
an
that.
eye-opening experience, man. Like Bill's grandfather was a head-cracking like police lieutenant who used to oppress civil rights activists, Black Panthers in Milwaukee. And then we interviewed, one of those former Black Panthers and just kind of reconciling, the past and the present and how we ended up with Trump as president.
Yeah.
And that was a great project. But after that, it was just like kind of up in the air.
What year was that?
That was 2016. The election was 2016, right?
November 2016.
So yeah, that was like
election,
early
yeah.
2017.
2017. Because
Yeah.
Bill Weir was a journalist. Like he was a full-time journalist for CNN.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We came over from ABC News together
Okay.
because he and I worked with Nightline prior to that. But yeah, after that, it just kind of the passion was gone for me. It's like I couldn't just see myself covering Trump for the next 4 years. That sounded like the last thing I wanted to
Right. That's the opposite of creating long-form content,
do.
right?
Yeah, or even if you do create long form content, like I just don't want to talk about this guy or talk to people who want to talk about this guy. One time was enough.
Time was enough. Yeah. So, okay. So obviously Trump gets elected. So where were you like 2018, 2019?
So I left CNN and then just spent a year just like developing some film projects and freelancing and just working on some smaller scale things. And then I decided it hit my 20-year mark in New York. I decided to move back to California, come back here.
That's fantastic. So where are you now in California?
I'm in Los Angeles.
Okay.
But prior to that, I mean, the plan had been to move to Los Angeles. But like about 10 days before I left New York, I linked up with the filmmaker Mark Levin, who's a very well-known documentary filmmaker. And he was in the process of developing a project about the city of Stockton, which is about 40 minutes from where I grew up in the Central Valley up north. Right? And Stockton, I think, is most famous for being the first major American city to declare bankruptcy about like 10 years ago.
Really?
Yeah.
I don't know this.
Yeah. So Stockton's like a port city. It's about 400, 500,000 people. A very checkered history of mismanagement, government malfeasance. The mayor, guy Silva, very colorful character. But at that time, a new mayor had just been elected. This guy Michael Tubbs, who was the youngest mayor of a major metropolitan city in America. He's African American also. He was 28, I believe, when he was elected. And he was instituting all these very progressive policy programs, including the country's first universal basic income program. So Mark was making a film about this, and he asked me to help him make this film. And it just happened to be right by where I grew up. So I delayed moving to Los Angeles and just kind of moved back to Turlock, where I lived when I was younger, and worked on that film for a year and a half, 2 years. And that aired on HBO.
That's great.
Yeah.
I think I remember you promoting that.
Yeah.
But I couldn't access it or watch it. I mean, like, it's funny. This platform, is pretty strange because I've been living abroad for so long and I've missed so much.
Yeah, it's hard to get HBO stuff internationally.
It is. Yeah. And it's hard to get HBO stuff internationally. Netflix, does it pretty well. We'll get into that in a bit, but it's but yeah, like just getting some stuff internationally is really impossible. And I've been in Dubai, for the last couple of years, and getting the kind of content that just getting everything that comes out here has been, very, very difficult. Yeah,
you got a lot of catching up to
do. I got a lot of stuff to watch in no time, as all of us. So you worked on this doc, and then what? Then COVID hit.
And COVID, exactly. So March of 2020, I'd actually found an apartment in LA.
Okay.
And I'm like, all right, cool. I'm gonna finally move. It's great. The movie's coming out. And then I decided to go to Spain for a month. A good friend of mine was getting married. Then I was gonna meet up with some other friends and just kind of like, get some travel time in
You went to
after
Spain for a wedding, like right after COVID?
before COVID.
Oh, before COVID. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I ended up actually spending 36 hours in Barcelona, and I fell asleep. Um,
And when you woke up, the world was closed.
well, no, I was woken up because my phone went
Oh yeah.
crazy
Yeah.
because I just started getting text messages like Trump's closing the border. He announced he's closing the border. I'm just like, I wake up at 5 in the morning. I'm just like, I don't know what's going on.
Yeah.
And at that point, people weren't sure how serious this was. So I had my
The good old days.
I mean, I had doubts about and reservations about going, but it's like
You
nobody's
got to
getting
live,
married.
man. You
Yeah,
got to live.
exactly,
Like you can't.
exactly.
I mean, and I remember the early days. Like everyone thought this was just going to be a China thing, and then people were like, okay, maybe just China and Italy. Because I was doing the same thing. I was sitting in Dubai, in between filming, and then like December, January, everyone was talking about China, and then in February, I filmed in Myanmar. I went to Burma, and did a whole thing, and got in and out of Myanmar with no
Wow,
problems.
that's a
And
close
that
call.
was February, yeah.
Yeah.
And then I went back to Dubai, and I was bored, and I was like, well, Africa's like open, so no one's closing borders in Africa. So I thought I'd just go to Ethiopia and just sit out another 2 weeks of people freaking out, and try to get, because I had all this crew and everyone was like,
Hmm.
are we filming? What's going on? I don't know if the borders are going to close. People are, and I'm like, let's all just get into Africa and start making some great content because there's great stories there and beautiful
Of
countryside, and
course.
Ethiopia is amazing. And then I was offline for like 2 days, and then we got up to the top of a mountain and my phone just exploded, and it was just like the whole world is closed. You're fucked.
Oh man, I remember waking up and just having to assess the situation in real time and buying a plane ticket as I'm packing. I'm like, I gotta get to the airport. I do not want to be stuck here.
Yeah.
So as I'm trying to buy the plane ticket, the price is going up simultaneously.
Yeah.
So somehow I managed to get a reasonable ticket back. I get to the airport 6 in the morning. There are like 500 Americans there, just all with the same idea as I have, And honestly, like I only been there 36 hours. I saw a lot of people that are on my outbound flight from San Francisco to Barcelona, because they were there for some cannabis convention, which got canceled.
The bitch convention. That's perfect. So a whole bunch of people are just sitting around the airport just smoking.
Yeah, yeah. That's what we did, and then we started just drinking some beers, and we're like, well, gotta make the best of a bad situation.
Yeah.
Managed to get out of the country and made it back home. Like 3 days after I left, and then the world shut down
Yeah.
for the next year.
And as a young filmmaker, I'm going to say we're both still pretty young, but as a young filmmaker, and content creator, like what was COVID like for you when you actually, because, the US is a little bit different because state by state, everyone did something different. Europe was very open, but closed to the rest of the world, but open within Europe. Like every kind of continent went about this in a different way. But what was it like, in California where you were, or just at home, or?
I mean, for me, it was completely shut down, because I was up north and not exactly a booming production landscape.
Yeah.
And obviously, I wasn't moving into the apartment I had found. But honestly, like I just took a step back from it and just kind of forgot about the professional aspect of it because for many months I think everything was shut down. It's hard to have FOMO when nothing's happening.
Yeah.
So just kind of try to make the best of it. I was actually very thankful to be home with my family, and be able to spend that time where we're all kind of stuck and shuttered with people I care about, and not have to worry about some of the other worries that people have in big cities. My friends in New York, traumatic experience, man. Like I know a lot of my friends have told me how they still at that time they every night you're hearing sirens. You live in a big apartment building, there's people dying in that building.
Yeah.
Even if you live in LA, like nothing's open, you can't really do anything.
Yeah.
So as a filmmaker, it sucks because you can't really make anything.
Right.
Although, I mean, you could have, like, so my friend who was getting married
Yeah. In Spain.
in Spain,
The Spanish wedding. Yeah.
he made the best of it. So he's a filmmaker also, but he ended up getting stuck in an apartment with his fiance and his mother, who flew in from Australia. They lived together in that apartment for like 6 months.
Are you joking?
I'm not joking.
6 months with your mother-in-law.
No, it was his mother and
Oh,
his wife's mother.
his wife's
His
mother-in-law.
now wife,
Yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah.
But they made the best of it. They made a web series called Cancelled. Um, and they got two
That could mean
seasons
so
out of
many
it.
things though. Like, were they, was it canceled because of COVID, or was it
Yeah.
canceled because he threw out some mean tweets or some mean X's,
No,
whatever
no,
it's
not a
called now?
cancel culture. No,
No.
specifically about the experience. And they acted in it, wrote it, directed it themselves, like inside the apartment. They
Yeah.
got two seasons out of it. And I believe, they got some funding for a feature.
Oh.
Yeah, because he's an Australian filmmaker. And, they have great resources in Australia.
Yeah.
Filmmakers. So
Government,
shout out Luke Eve.
government resources.
Yeah.
Canada has a bunch of that too, but you have to like live in Canada, and I haven't really got around to living in Canada. That's my own problem though. So I'll keep you from that. But okay. So actually, you mentioned something. FOMO is huge in our space. Like, there's nothing worse in the world than the fear of missing out.
Mm.
And I think, like, especially when you're here today to promote something, we'll talk about that later.
Sure.
But when you see your friends or your colleagues, working, making stuff, putting stuff out into the world that they're super proud of, etc., you do have huge FOMO. It's like, oh my god, what am I doing? What's going on? And you're right. During COVID, no one did anything, and it was just quiet. But that was also, I mean, for the first like 2 or 3 weeks, maybe it was like relaxing. Like, you didn't have to wake up and like check your emails every 5 seconds. But then after that, it was just kind of creepy and lonely.
Mm. And for me, that's why I was very glad to be with my family, right? Because it would have been a completely different situation if like you're isolated in a city and you can't even see your friends and you're separated from your family, and there are no social events or places. There's no restaurants or bars you can go to. So just the fact that like I hadn't lived at home since I was 17, so it was a big adjustment.
Yeah.
But I'm just very thankful to have had that time, and it allowed me the space to kind of look inward instead of outward.
Mm.
After having spent almost 10 years just making things on the road, internationally, traveling all the time, and then just like shifting the gaze inward, I think it was good for me, and I'm very blessed to have had that opportunity. I think during a very difficult time for the world.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. That's a really positive outtake. I was stuck in Istanbul and
That's
isolated.
different.
Isolated.
But you found the cats.
I did find the cats, yeah. So that's one of the
Positive.
good things, and I haven't had too many podcast guests cancel because of the cats. So that's also a good sign. I was a little bit worried about that. But so what's the space been like for you coming out of COVID, fresh, recovering? Did you have a bunch of new ideas? I mean, I guess we can start getting into your documentary Man on the Run, which comes out on January 5th on Netflix.
Yep, worldwide.
Worldwide, which is exciting. And so I guess I would love to hear your role in putting this together. And I think beyond just talking about the 1MDB scandal, which was huge, but people seem to have forgotten about it. So this is great timing. I would love to understand as much as you want to share about how you put this project together, how you became interested in it, how you pitched it, who you pitched it to, if you want to talk about that, because for the audience out there, this kind of stuff is hard to do. And what you've done, kudos to you. I mean, it's incredible. I can't wait to watch it tomorrow with the rest of the world. But putting content together is a bitch. And I would love to hear your struggle, because I think there's so much good value that can come out of that for young filmmakers and content makers.
Yeah, I mean, where should I start?
I think how did you? Okay, so walk me through what the topic is, and why it was important, maybe, and then how you decided like, oh, that's going to be my next story to tell.
Yeah,
that'd be great.
So coming out of COVID, I think once 2021 hit, people started firing up the old cameras again, and more work started coming in. So I was lucky enough to work on some projects. The Wonderlist fired back up, so we shot an episode of that. I made a short documentary with my friend and collaborator Joe Simon called 7 Years and Counting, a social justice doc in Texas. And then collaborated with American Rivers on a documentary about the Colorado River, which is a passion project of mine. But then I got linked up with my partners at Evergreen Media, who are very interested in creating nonfiction content about international subjects. And I think 1MDB was one of the first things we spoke about. And 1MDB, for those who don't know, stands for One Malaysia Berhad Development, and it's a sovereign wealth fund that the government of Malaysia created about, let's say, 15 years ago. And a sovereign wealth fund is typically created by countries like the UAE or Kuwait or Saudi Arabia that have a lot of oil money, they have a lot of excess money, which most governments in the world don't have. But those that do have excess money create wealth funds where they can invest in infrastructure, projects that can benefit their citizens, or sometimes they'll buy Manchester City Football
I
Club.
was just gonna say, yeah, if you're an English Premier club,
Then you
that's
know
yeah,
what it
then
is.
you know exactly what's going on. Yeah, they own like every like PSG is owned by the
The
Qatari
Qataris,
area,
yep.
and half of the
Live
English
Golf.
Premiership, Live Golf, yeah,
Yeah.
Saudi Public Investment
Yep,
Fund, yeah.
exactly.
So 1MDB is the Malaysian sovereign wealth fund,
Yes.
basically.
So the difference being, Malaysia is not a country with excess funds that can create something like this.
So there's the rub. Okay, so now the premise has been laid.
Yes.
Yes.
So this gentleman named Jolo, who I think our age, but he's from Malaysia, but went to boarding school in London at a place called Harrow, which advertises itself for having educated 7 prime ministers.
Harrow. That's where the William and Harry went, I think, too. Right? Is that the royal families, prime ministers?
Sure.
They all go to the same
Sure,
schools, I guess, right?
exactly.
Yeah.
So he went there. Then he went to the University of Pennsylvania and Wharton School of Business. And along the way, he figured out something that a lot of people figure out later in life. It's all about who you know.
That's the truth. Yeah, that is the truth.
Yeah, he's going to school with like the sons of Middle Eastern royalty and very wealthy businessmen, and he realizes that the value, the capital of human relationships is based on this: who you know, who you can make deals with, especially at the very upper levels of society.
So this is really important. Like this is how all of old Europe works, and for you're well traveled, I'm well traveled. I've lived abroad pretty much my whole adult life. Like this is how everything works. So as a young guy growing up in California, did you realize like your own personal network and who you go to school with, and like that there are people who like focus only entirely on that aspect of networking, only for business opportunities that may or may not come afterwards? Like, did that open a world to you, or were you already like well savvy about that kind of existence?
Honestly, I think for me, I just kind of fly by the seat of my pants sometimes. And I went to Columbia in New York, so going there, you learn pretty quickly how the world works, how those kinds of relationships work, and you see the hierarchy of things living in New York and going to school with a lot of legacies and children of alumni, but then also, kind of learning what Columbia and all the other Ivy League schools are about.
So you went from small town California as a Korean immigrant, South Korean immigrant, to Columbia.
Yeah, but I grew up in Gangnam in Seoul, which for those who don't, I mean, everyone knows the song Gangnam Style,
Everyone knows
right?
that song,
So,
exactly.
for me, it's like I always needed to get back to a city. Um, I was 7 or 6 or 7 when I left, but like, back in the day in the 80s, like kids run around like headless chickens, right? Like I remember just running around Seoul, like in Gangnam, like when I was a kid. And then to be stuck in like this very small town here in Northern California, it was a huge culture shock.
Sure.
So going back to a bigger city in New York, I think for me, it was just, it felt like home.
Okay.
The first day I remember stepping off the plane, walking up and down Broadway, like 110th Street, and just being like, damn, this was very familiar.
Oh, that's good. So being in a big city was a comforting feeling for
100%,
you.
yeah.
And Columbia is a strange beast. Like I've been there a lot. I actually gave some lectures there. One of my best friends teaches in journalism there. One of my good friends, Howard W. French, who wrote for the New York Times when I was working in China for so many years. So I go back and do some stuff with him from time to time. But it's such a beautiful spot, such a beautiful campus.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite places in New York City.
Yeah.
It's a great place to go to school. You have access to everything, but you're also insulated from kind of the outside. But so Jolo, obviously, he's in these kind of similar environments, and through his foreign education, he becomes friends with Riza Aziz, who's the stepson of the former Prime Minister of Malaysia, Najib Razak, who back then I believe was the defense minister of the country when he met Riza. Now, Jolo somehow makes his way back to Malaysia and has this idea to create a sovereign wealth fund. And now Najib Razak is the prime minister, and he spent many years cultivating this familiar relationship with that family.
Right.
So he convinces the then prime minister to start a sovereign wealth fund called 1MDB. And that's where it all starts.
And where do they get the money? Because obviously you said Malaysia doesn't have the oil wealth or the natural gas wealth that like a Saudi Arabia or a Qatar would have. So Malaysia is a pretty small country, kind of wedged in between what, Thailand and Singapore,
Yeah.
right in the peninsula there. Like I've been to Malaysia a few times, and yeah, never thought it like beautiful people, beautiful culture. Um, but they don't have huge amounts of natural resources or real wealth. I mean, Kuala Lumpur is a beautiful city, but the rest of the country is pretty rural. Like they do a lot of, it's a huge farming community. Like where are they getting billions of dollars to?
That's the rub, right? Like you said, I mean, it's taxpayer money. It's debt, right? Like they take the taxpayer money and they invest it into these projects. And the first major project was a joint venture with a company called Petro Saudi out of London, which was at that time essentially a shell company operated by one of the several dozen princes of Saudi Arabia, who was also just a front man using his name for legitimacy, run by this gentleman named Tariq Obaid and Patrick Mahoney, these two very shady characters that come from these old Europe type of social backgrounds. And they decided to do a joint venture where Malaysia would put in $1 billion of cash of taxpayer funds, and Petro Saudi would put up these assets, oil fields based in Turkmenistan that are
Turkmenistan
purportedly valued at $3.2 billion. But the whole process of that valuation was completely fraudulent. They hired this gentleman who's, I can't remember his name, but he's one of those guys that's always on like CNBC or like MSNBC. He's worked for the government, Department of Energy, in a number of different places. And Patrick Mahoney had a connection to him, and he paid him $250,000 to make a valuation of these assets sight unseen over a weekend.
He never went to Turkmenistan to review the oil.
No, and he asked him like, "How much do you want me to say this is worth?" Like this is all documented. It's all the evidence is out there. I asked this gentleman to come onto the documentary. Of course, he wouldn't.
No, of course not. But so this is like 15 years ago. Malaysia create a sovereign wealth fund out of nothing, fund it with taxpayer money, and basically like this guy Jolo was in charge of the sovereign wealth fund.
He was the shadow player. So the then Prime Minister Najib Razak was the chairman of 1MDB. He was also the prime minister of the country, and he was also the finance minister of the country.
How do you get that job? That's a great trifecta, isn't it? I'm going to be the finance minister, the prime minister, and also run our multi-billion-dollar sovereign wealth fund. Like
so checks and balances.
Absolute corruption. What is it? Absolute power corrupts absolutely. Yeah, something exactly like that.
Right, yeah. So when this deal takes place, Malaysia puts in $1 billion. Immediately, they siphon off $700 million, and they deposit that into a shell company operated by Jolo. And that's when the fireworks started. That's when him and his conspirators started spending money like it was going out of style.
Now, from the outside looking in, someone who has not obviously made a documentary about this like you have, but from the outside looking in, the biggest scandal that came out of this for the Western English-speaking media was definitely the Wolf of Wall Street.
Yes.
So this guy Jolo came to Hollywood, to Tinseltown, to where we are, and basically wanted to throw some money around and make some friends, I guess, right?
That's exactly right. So he spent many years cultivating relationships with celebrities, reaching out to managers and agents and offering them six-figure sums to spend an evening with them, hanging out, having dinner, partying. Some notable names, obviously Leonardo DiCaprio, Jamie Foxx, Paris Hilton, Kim Kardashian, the list goes on.
Is the Britney Spears rumor that he paid her like $1 million to jump out of a birthday cake, was that real?
Yes, that was at a birthday party that Jolo threw for himself on the Las Vegas Strip.
Nice.
And this all came out, through testimony, court trials, backed up by figures, contracts, and numbers, and it's purported that Leonardo DiCaprio received to $250,000 a night for a period of like 5 years. And Jamie Foxx as well, to hang out with Jolo and his friends. And there's video in the film of Jamie Foxx. He's a guest on, I believe it's the Graham Norton show, or it's one of these like talk shows. I think it's in Australia.
Yeah.
He's telling the interviewer about how, I have this rich friend. He has this luxury 747 jumbo jet, and we celebrated New Year's Eve in Australia, partied all night, and then flew the jet to Las Vegas to get ahead of the time difference, and then celebrate New Year's Eve one more time.
That sounds like something that only someone who has a 747 luxury private jet would do, right?
Exactly.
That's
right. And a bunch
fantastic.
of stolen money.
Yeah. Wow. So, okay, so $1 billion goes from the Sovereign Wealth Fund in Malaysia to a UK shell company, which has nothing going on. Somehow that transaction happened without any real regulation. And then 700 goes out of that fund into Jolo's fund and just gets pissed away, his slush fund.
Yeah, and then, he just starts spreading the wealth amongst all his conspirators, including the former Prime Minister Najib Razak, as well as a gentleman named Yusuf Al-Otaiba, who is the current ambassador to the United States from the United Arab Emirates, and was one of Jolo's early contacts in the Middle East.
Are we going to have difficulties walking down the street after this conversation?
I mean, I hope not. But this is all, published evidence. This is all based on the journalistic work of all the people featured in the film, including, Bradley Hope and Tom Wright, formerly the Wall Street Journal, Clara Rucastle Brown of the Sarawak Report, who was instrumental in kind of breaking the story apart, the Edge Malaysia newspaper, like all these people who did really incredible investigative journalism and actually had, safety issues and concerns because of their work. That was the whole point of this project, was to kind of put a nice little bow on the hard work they did, right? Like, I'm just putting it together in a visual package.
Yeah, I think it's and like I said earlier, like it's great timing, because I think a lot of people have forgotten about that scandal, and I think like I love to be honest, Netflix is probably one of the better platforms at the moment producing these kinds of documentaries that are just taking that look back at that thing that happened like 5 or 10 years ago, once all the dust settles, because you can't do the documentary you just did. You can't do that documentary 10 years ago because it was all still unfolding, right?
Exactly.
Like,
yeah.
you got to give the court the time to go through it. You got to give the journalists the time to do their investigations, and then finally, once all that dust is settled, then someone like you can go in and make a visual story, which can then be distributed globally via a Netflix or another streaming partner.
The crazy thing is, like, so many things happened while we were in post-production that we were definitely having to navigate present day developments in the story and adjusting.
Really, so stuff was happening like on the fly. So you're there in post, putting stuff together, and a new wrinkle appears, and you have someone else you have to interview, or some other angle, tangent that you have to like fold into your existing story.
Well, I think the biggest thing that happened is, while I was in Malaysia, that was March of 2022, and then we went into post-production in the summer. I interviewed the former Prime Minister Najib Razak.
Yeah.
And then I also interviewed the opposition leader, Anwar Ibrahim, who's a very celebrated figure in international politics.
Anwar Ibrahim was like the Prime Minister of Malaysia for like 20 years or something, wasn't he? Or
no. He was actually the current Prime Minister of Malaysia.
Oh, okay.
And that happened in November of this 2022, not 2023, while we're in the middle of finishing the film. And the former Prime Minister, Najib Razak, was sent to prison, I think, like 6 months after I interviewed him, or maybe not, 4 months even. So this all happened as we're scripting and trying to finish the film.
So heads did roll in Malaysia for this.
There's been some accountability, but as the title suggests, Jolo is still out there. He's on the run. A lot of lower level bankers, I think, in Singapore and other places, did get some slaps on the wrist, but the major players, no. Aside from Najib Razak, I would be hard pressed to name anyone really who's been held accountable.
I read something that Goldman Sachs was fined because of something that happened here. What was that? Can you explain the Goldman Sachs angle?
Yeah, so after that joint venture with Petro-Saudi, 1MDB kept puttering on for many, many years, and the basis of the next few frauds were these bond deals that were brokered by Goldman Sachs. Three separate bond sales in the total amount of $6.5 billion. Now, typically in a
Six point
six,
five billion.
but these were fraudulent bonds, right? So typically, a government sells bonds to raise money for projects, infrastructure projects, and they're guaranteed by the country, right? And Jolo, through his Middle Eastern connections, also got the UAE to guarantee some of these bonds, so that on paper they look like they're very secure.
Like AAA government bonds, never defaults, top of the top.
Exactly.
Right.
But with the help of a gentleman named Tim Leisner and Roger Ng, who are both Goldman bankers based out of Southeast Asia, they put together these fraudulent bond deals where Goldman Sachs bought all the bonds and then sold them themselves after market, and then took a 10% commission on all the sales, making over $600 million in profits, whereas industry standard for this kind of deal is something like 1%. Because
so they took a 10% cut on reselling
fake bonds.
Fake bonds.
Yeah. Because typically when you're selling government bonds, it's a very safe asset. There's no like auction process. There's not a lot of work that has to be done.
Well, yeah, I mean, so for example, China has a sovereign wealth fund, and only because I lived in China for so many years, and they have like a mandate where a certain percentage of the sovereign wealth fund has to be held in U.S. Treasuries.
Mm.
So that's why China is the largest holder globally of
debt.
U.S. Treasuries.
Yeah.
So because they have to buy it because it fits their risk tolerance for their sovereign wealth fund. So clearly, Jolo and these guys were trying to put together something as bulletproof as a U.S. Treasury
on the surface.
Right? And then shuffle it around to 1MDB because everyone knew they were spending, and they had no idea what they were doing.
Yeah. And because the bankers were in on it, Tim Leisner, I think, is reported to have received over $100 million from Jolo for his part in this transaction. Anyways, Goldman was found liable, monetarily at least. I believe they paid like a
no bankers go to jail. No. We know this for sure. I mean,
that's a big
financially liable is where the conversation stops. It's just like everyone just wants a fine. Everyone just wants a payment.
But that's they build it into the cost of doing business. You know what I mean? Like
they do,
and that's a big part of what we talk about in a third act of film. It's like, listen, unless there are actual penalties, there's a reason these things keep happening. This isn't the first financial scandal, nor is it even the last. Even when we're making the film, SBF and FTX, Sam Bankman-Fried, and this cryptocurrency exchange that goes belly up. Before that, Bernie Madoff. You can go back to the 80s, the savings and loan scandal. I mean, this shit happens over and over because there are no safeguards and because there are no penalties.
The best part, now, I see. So I like to categorize your 1MDB documentary that you've put together, coming out January 5th on Netflix globally. I like to put that in the same kind of package as the Bernie Madoff, because Netflix came out with the Bernie Madoff doc. I think I watched it on Netflix. Let's assume I did, and I definitely saw it. I think it was on Netflix. But again, they came out and investigated it. 15 years after it happened, right? And then you can actually see like that kind of time gives you like a visual horizon that you couldn't have had in the moment, right? Which is what all the journalists were writing about at the time. But then, 10, 15 years after this stuff happens, it's unbelievable the kind of impact that it has on people's lives. So the 1MDB, so that was taxpayer money. But did anyone's like life get completely destroyed, or was it just kind of mismanaged government money?
Yeah, I mean, there were a lot of people who suffered. So one of the ways that Jolo's involvement in the scandal was discovered by journalists was Claire Rucastle Brown met Xavier Justo, who was the number 3 executive at PetroSaudi at the time of the joint venture. And he had a falling out with the heads of PetroSaudi, who were obviously very corrupt. And as he departed, he took a copy of their server with him. And because they refused to pay him a severance package that they had negotiated. So when this scandal was percolating in Malaysia, and there were a lot of rumors about what's happening, he reached out via intermediaries to a number of journalists, Claire Rucastle Brown, as well as Hokai Tot of The Edge. And they met in Singapore to go over the data, and they found the documents that literally traced the path of the money from the Malaysian government to the joint venture to Jolo. So when this happens, this is a smoking gun. A couple years later, in an act of retribution, Xavier Justo was arrested by Thai police and sent to prison, and pressured to sign a confession where he would have to admit that he altered the data and was attempting to overthrow a democratically elected government in Malaysia. And he ended up spending something like 547 days in Thai prison, separated from his family.
That can't be easy. 547 days in a Thai prison after rolling like a billionaire for like a decade probably.
Well, not a billionaire, but he's he's a businessman.
Yeah.
Also, there was a prosecutor in the district attorney's office in Kuala Lumpur who drafted an arrest warrant for the then Prime Minister Najib Razak as the investigations in Malaysia were really coming to a head. And there's this thing called the Night of the Long Knives, which is named after the Nazi Germany evening. But there was the evening where Najib Razak decided to squash all the investigations happening against him. And part of that was shutting down the district attorney, shutting down the attorney general, and then all the heads of the various investigatory agencies, including the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission, were forced to resign their posts. But the attorney who drafted this document, his name was Kevin Moraes, he was pulled from his car at an intersection in Kuala Lumpur, disappeared, and then was later found in an oil drum, murdered.
So that's real. That's the real deal, isn't it?
Yeah.
Oh, so should we watch the trailer?
Sure.
Yeah, for everyone out there, this is where things get technical for me. So let me move into here. Okay, you're over there. Perfect. I've got it queued up. We are going to have a look here at Man on the Run, coming out on Netflix. Okay, we gotta go now to this one. Bang. And here we go.
Today, the Department of Justice has filed a civil complaint seeking to forfeit and recover more than $1 billion in assets stolen from one MDB.
One MDB was a development fund created to help the development of infrastructure in Malaysia.
There were murmurings. Some transactions were not kosher, but we had to get some evidence.
There was a guy that had the inside data, $700 million into this account. He said, that's Jolo's company. At that moment, I knew I had a huge story.
We put together the largest international corruption case in the history of Justice Department.
They used the money to pay gambling debts at Las Vegas casinos, a Bombardier jet.
Hundreds of millions of dollars into the Wolf of Wall Street production.
Jolo never had any official role, but he's always seen with the Prime Minister.
He was trying to create a fictional backstory for himself.
Surrounded by the likes of Leonardo DiCaprio and Paris Hilton, Jamie Foxx. He had a little bit of a crush on Britney Spears. Paid her $1 million to help out with a birthday cake.
Like a lot of lower level criminals, they don't have a long-term plan, except he was able to inject himself into this top 1%.
There was a real concern that who have we gotten ourselves in bed with here, and is this going to end the way we're worried it might?
Malaysia was always an autocratic regime with a velvet glove. At this point, Najib took off the velvet glove. The lawyer in the Attorney General's office was pulled from his car.
He was found murdered in an oil drum. There were massive protests going on.
We need a clean government.
Just because you take action against the man at the top doesn't mean that everybody else is absolved.
It is an unjust system, enriching the few at the expense of the majority. So what's the answer? The answer is back to the people.
Where do you think Jolo is?
I have no idea.
No worries, we're back. So that is Man on the Run, coming out on Netflix January 5th. And I mean, first of all, congratulations. This is exciting. That teaser was awesome. So how did you go about getting this into the Netflix ecosystem? Because I think that's something, a lot of people out there want to know. Like, how do these big, massive streaming companies that no one really knows how they work, how do they choose a project like yours, and how do you even get a project like that in front of them?
I gotta be honest, and it was a difficult process because it's been a rough year plus for nonfiction content and the business in general. So we finished the film, and we're in discussions and negotiations with a number of U.S. based sales agents.
So wait, so you went out and executed on the doc without having it sold already. So you were going to go through the film festival circuit? Was that one of the plans?
I think that was one of the plans. I mean, we had a multi-pronged approach to it. Obviously, film festivals are part of that, but the other thing is you secure an agreement with a sales agent that then shops the film for you, whether or not, depending on what film festival you get into. But things kind of came to a head because there's just a dead market, especially starting with last year's Sundance. I believe like maybe 2 of the films sold at the festival, and typically, especially in the nonfiction category we're talking about, typically most of them sell in previous years. But that first event just kind of created a bottleneck throughout the year where nonfiction programming was just not selling.
So Sundance is what, like mid-January, late January every year.
It's the first festival in the whole circuit.
Right.
Yeah.
And if stuff doesn't sell, if nonfiction stuff doesn't sell at Sundance, then it's going to be a slow year, basically.
Well, it just backs up, right? Because films are coming out constantly. But if the sales agents have inventory that hasn't sold, it creates a bottleneck by which they're unable to take on new projects to sell, also, especially because the older stuff isn't selling. And, I think a lot of films this year kind of suffered because of this, because now you're having to go to all these smaller festivals and trying to get eyeballs on your films to find a buyer, to find a sales agent willing to take on the project. And I'll tell you right now, like we only had one sales agent that was U.S. based willing to take on our film, because I don't think some of them didn't want to get involved for ancillary reasons. Some of them probably just didn't even have bandwidth to watch the film.
I think, yeah, the bandwidth of watching the content is actually, the big issue. I know I have sales agents too that work on my TV shows, and you offload 8 hours, a year on them, and they don't watch any.
Yeah,
of
how
it.
are they going to watch that?
They don't. Yeah, and the people who buy it, I don't even think they don't watch a lot of it either. But that's another story. But surely, like, some sales agent would have been like, oh, this is going to sell in Asia. Like, Asians must want to know the depth of this story and the way you've crafted the narrative.
Well, that was kind of the idea I had, and I wasn't sure if it was going to work. But so we had an offer from one U.S. based sales agent, and then I asked our Malaysian producer Fabian Joseph to find me a reputable sales agent in Malaysia, because I figured at the worst case I could definitely get Southeast Asia rights sold, right? And
Yeah,
then,
at least. And like in Singapore, this stuff, they love this stuff.
Yeah.
Like, because Singapore, and Malaysia have a strange relationship. Like,
Oh, yeah.
they love learning about all the dirt going on in each other's
Exactly.
countries. So,
And the story itself takes place somewhat in Singapore and involves a lot of Singaporean entities.
Yeah.
So we ended up speaking to this Malaysia-based sales agent, Nads Media, and
parent company, 1MDB. No, just joking. Somehow the Sovereign Wealth Fund bought the rights of their own, documentary so they could bury it.
and then put it on Netflix.
That's how twisted the world could be, but not today.
Maybe they would have given me more money.
They would have. You know what they would have done is they would have paid extra for it, buried it, and then funded your next project. That's what they should have done.
I would have to evaluate.
Would have been a tough. I would have to think about that over a few whiskeys.
But so I was able to successfully have the sales agent receive an offer for Southeast Asia rights. And at that point, we were still talking to the U.S.-based sales agents. But we figured, why not see if we can kind of expand the parameters of the existing deal? And yeah, they were successfully able to do so and get us a worldwide deal through the Singapore office.
So that's amazing. So the Singapore office signed a worldwide deal for Man on the Run with Netflix, not the California-based team. It's strange how stuff works like that. Like, people just figure, oh yeah, I'll just talk to the director of nonfiction content at.
I believe she left the company last year, so I don't even know if that position's been filled.
I lived abroad. We won't get too much into me, but like I lived abroad I've been living abroad since 2001, right? And I used to once I started having a bit of juice behind my work, I would come to LA and New York like once a year. And every single time I came to LA, New York was a little bit more stable, especially like with the magazines back in journalism days. But in LA, like it feels like everyone was changing jobs all the time, at least at my level, because at my level, I wasn't getting to meet the real decision makers. I was meeting their like executive assistants or, the associate production executives or whatever. And these people underneath the people who make like the real decision making, like they're changing jobs every 18 months.
Yeah.
And it was impossible to like make a friend. Like ruthless.
I believe it. But I think what happened over the last year to 18 months is that the people above those people finally started like getting pushed out as well, with all these mergers and acquisitions going on, it's just been a tough time. A lot of people aren't acquiring new projects or content.
Are you seeing that just in nonfiction or fiction as well?
I think primarily in nonfiction, because that's been kind of where my head's been at the last couple of years. But obviously with the strikes, like it's just been a tough time for everyone in general in this town.
You're right. I mean, that's kind of been overlooked. We had the writers' strike, which happened in May, and then finished first, and then the actors' strike started in June or July, just ended.
Yep.
And I've heard murmurings. I don't know if you can actually say this, but rumors of the production crew union may be going on strike next. I've heard a little bit about this.
I mean, it all depends on how fair the corporate overlords are willing to be, and I think, the strike was painful for a lot of people, not just the people in the unions, but everyone who works in production. But also, you can't just keep rolling over for these people who speak only to shareholders. You got to stick up for the people that actually make the content. So I fully support all this unionized labor movements and trying to get what we can, because it's a tough business already, and you can't live and make a career out of this on substandard wages.
No, that's true, and just revenue sharing too. I mean, like when you think about this is I think this was one of the topics for the actors' strike, and maybe also the writers' strike too, is residuals. Like, when you make content, like I know this from my own space, because when I wanted to go out and start making content, no one wanted to work with me. So I would have loved to take in a couple $100,000 from Nat Geo or whatever and gone out and made stuff and then just given it to them. And then I would have been on Nat Geo. But they didn't want anything to do with me. And neither did all the other, broadcasters. So I had to go out and raise money by myself, fund it by myself. And then, but then the flip side of that was I owned it. And I still get royalties today on that. And when I think about how tough COVID was for me, and because I was making adventure content for almost a decade and then had to stop, those royalties really helped me, get through. And when you're making a day rate or a day wage as an actor and you're below the line, below title, and you're not getting an equity in the project and stuff like that, when tough times come, they really slaughter you.
Oh, 100%. And especially with writers, right? Like writers don't work a full year. If you're on a show, you're on that show for, most of the year, but then you're on hiatus. And then if the show gets canceled, like most shows do, then you're trying to find the next job, right? So those royalties, those residuals are what keep people afloat. That's how people can pay mortgage payments, send kids to school.
Yeah.
That's the whole basis of this industry.
Yeah.
But that kind of foundation is being eroded by corporate overlords year after year. And so I think the strike was a very necessary clawback of a lot of what's been lost. It's not a story that's finished yet.
Right. And I mean, I read the news, you read the news, it's funny, but a lot of people have been saying like the studios, the traditional filmmaking studios should all do deals with SAG-AFTRA on their own.
Absolutely.
And then have the tech guys.
The tech companies aren't
streaming partners. Yeah. They don't really know how to structure these deals, and they keep it all for themselves.
Well, it's not even that they don't know; they don't care. Barry Diller made that point. It's like, why does Apple and Amazon and Netflix, why do they belong in the same room as like Warner Brothers, Paramount, whoever? I mean, Amazon bought MGM, but they exist for separate reasons, right? And so once we start conflating technology companies with actual Hollywood studios, that's why they find themselves in the situation they're in. Like, the market isn't going to support more than one streamer, or like maybe two, but like I think everyone has found out. You mentioned Quibi earlier, like these aren't like small endeavors you can go on. So like when Max pulls back Friends from Netflix and then doesn't take in the hundreds of $1 million in licensing fees that year so that they can put it on Max, but they're not making that money back on subscriber fees, of course they're going to lose money, right? So they're shooting themselves in the foot to compete with Netflix on a platform and in a field that they're not qualified to compete with Netflix on.
Sure.
And then you see that kind of problem play out over and over on a smaller scale or bigger scale repeatedly. Now you have Warner Brothers stock price treading where it's at and talking about merging with Paramount. But these are all kind of self-inflicted problems.
Right. And where do you, I think in the early days, a lot of content creators like myself, we were super excited about streaming because it was an extra place to pitch to. And I think, but then like you said, like the deals are different and the way you're treated are different. And, it can be quite difficult to understand even how many people have seen your show and the geographical, breakdown of where people are watching it. And then of course, when you work with a streamer, there's no residuals at all. It's a one payment game. And that's tough.
The tech companies have no incentive to tell you anything, right? Because why should they, if they're not obligated to, why should they give you any information or residuals?
Yeah.
And I think the whole industry is really screwed up by abandoning linear cable so quickly. Obviously, it's a dying platform.
I have a linear cable story, though. Hold on. I'll try to be as democratic as possible. But I worked for BBC for like years, but I never worked directly with them. So I pitched them originally. They said, oh, blah blah blah, maybe. But they had a bit of an issue because I wasn't British. So the BBC,
yeah, Commonwealth.
Well, Commonwealth, Canadians, exactly. But so BBC is actually two entities. There's BBC in the United Kingdom, and then there's BBC Studios International, right? So BBC in the United Kingdom can only really spend money on like UK talent, like from the top all the way down, like directors, producers, on camera talent. The whole thing needs to be like British. And then BBC Studios, which my shows were on, they're much more flexible. They're run commercially. They're not run on taxpayer dollars. And my shows were pretty popular. And I remember talking to like people at the BBC. I was like, can you guys ever like show me, where my show is most popular or who's watching it in Singapore? Because that information would have helped me raise more money to get more content made, right? And they never did. And I was like, well, how do I know, that I'm doing a good job? And they're like, well, we'll buy your next season when it's ready. And that was all I ever got from them, which was great because I had something to work towards. But I think it really it definitely hurt me fundraising wise because I was working with corporate sponsors. I was working with tourism bureaus. I was trying to find any way to make it work because the money I was getting, as acquisition fees and stuff like that wasn't enough to cover the costs.
And it's opaque for a reason.
Yeah.
Because those people
who wins
money.
Who wins by not telling me everything?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But why are we abandoning cable just to bundle streaming platforms for the consumer? And even DVDs. Why do people stop selling DVDs? I still buy DVDs, because they take stuff off platforms.
Hold on. You still buy DVDs?
Yeah, Criterion Collection, man.
Criterion Collection.
Hell yeah.
Yeah. You still watch stuff?
Yeah, absolutely.
Everything's available on YouTube.
It's not.
Everything's on YouTube.
Yeah, but I have a very expensive 4K TV, so I want to watch things in crystal clear. I don't want to stream some illegal crap on YouTube where it looks like
not streaming. No, so this is one of the things I figured out since I moved back to North America recently, is that you can go on YouTube and find any old movie for $3.99.
I know.
Yeah.
Listen, I think people are finally realizing that a lot of these streaming platforms, you can't count on them to hold the things you want to see. Some people just want to watch their favorite movies. I watched Midnight Run on Netflix the other night because it said it was leaving Netflix, and that's one of my favorite movies. So I gotta actually buy the DVD of Midnight Run at some point because now it's not on Netflix. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And $15 for that, I'm fine with paying that.
Okay, so I still have DVDs, by the way. I can show you some on the way out. I've got Tough Rides China, Tough Rides India. No one's buying them, but if I can get one into your hands, I will. I got a little care package after I'll give you.
Nice.
No, that'd be good. Yeah. So, okay, so you're in LA, you're promoting, Man on the Run. January 5th, Netflix. What next? Like, how do you come off of doing your first? Because I think this is really interesting for me, and hopefully for other people out there, is like you've worked so much, like the last 20 years almost, on other people's stuff, and that's how you get started in this industry, right? You work for other production companies, you work with other directors, you work for other producers, you work with Bill Weir, CNN. Now it seems like, with this Netflix documentary, this is like your baby, this is your vision. Like, obviously the goal would be not to work for other people anymore and to keep promoting and working on your own projects. So how do you now make this transition from this project into something you want to do next?
That's a great question. Do you know the answer?
No, I don't know the answer. There's no answer. Like,
no,
there's no, like, people don't understand. Like, there is no rhyme or reason to why anything gets done in this town.
Not at all.
Or in content creation. Like, you can't predict. Like, you can have a hit movie on Netflix or with Warner Brothers or with Disney or whatever, and then go cold for 3 years.
Yeah. And I mean, hopefully that doesn't happen to me, but
hopefully not. No, we didn't just jinx it here on the show.
I mean, part of it's just also kind of seeing how this thing lands and hopefully leveraging the moment. I have a bunch of projects I've developed and have been developing, but I'm also interested in kind of getting out of the unscripted nonfiction space. I'm definitely more interested in working in narrative projects. So I have a few things I've written that I'm planning on filming this spring. So I have a trifecta of short films I'm making. One's animated, two are live action. Put that out there just to see how it lands also. And then, I'm not abandoning the nonfiction space. I have a couple different documentary projects, including a series, adventure series I'm pitching around.
Sure.
But really, like, you gotta keep grinding. That's really all it is.
It's such a fucking grind.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I had
it's not that bad. It is a grind. Don't get me wrong. For whoever's listening, it is a massive grind. But then you could also be working a 9-to-5 job, and that's, I think, a worse fate.
That can be a worse fate for some. Hopefully, we didn't offend anyone out there working 9 to 5.
Mad respect for everyone working a 9 to 5. Just not for me.
Not for me either. Not for me either. But so I mean, as a content creator, sometimes,
and I hate that term personally.
Okay, but we're not Instagram.
I'm an artist,
celebrities.
Man. I'm okay with that. I'm. The older I get, the more willing I am to embrace. Like, you know what? I'm just trying to make art.
Yeah,
that's fine.
Artist, storyteller, creator. Yeah.
Content is how they commoditize what we do and reduce us to numbers on a spreadsheet. Like, fuck that.
We can't let them do that.
And then, it's a changing world. And all these, like you said, Instagram influencers. Listen, man, what happened to having didn't you used to have talent before, like, you could be somebody? Now we have all.
There's no talent anymore.
There's no talent anymore.
It's like we're all just living in a world of, like, who has the prettiest feet. Okay, back on track here. So a lot of storytellers and creative souls like us, we sometimes have to divide up our time between projects that will earn an income and projects that are kind of moonshots, right? Mm-hmm. So, are you, now that you've got this Netflix series coming out, obviously your reputation will be, kind of propelled into the light because of that.
Will it though? I don't know.
Well, that's the thing. Like, and then will you be known for nonfiction? And then are you going to try to do some fiction? Are you going to try to do maybe a few more nonfiction stuff just because maybe you'll have a bit of cachet in that space and then maybe you can, funnel some capital into one of your, scripted projects or something?
Listen, I got a lot of bandwidth. I can do multiple things. And obviously I love the nonfiction space, but I do want new challenges, right? Like, no one wants to do the same thing over and over. So sure. The projects I've been developing are stories that I think are very important and need to be told. So I'm very interested in getting those things off the ground. Mm-hmm. At the same time, I do want to challenge myself in different ways.
Yeah. I loved meeting you when you were doing Wonderlist with Bill Weir because and I think we talked about this during my COVID call on Instagram way back in the day, 2020, when I was stuck in Turkey. But I always love chatting with you because you do so much. and I think that like this is something that a lot of people don't get. Like when you come up through the entertainment industry, and you don't make it to the top on day one, which very few of us do. Like you end up doing pre-production, you end up field producing, you end up doing audio, you end up managing the B or the C cam, you end up, dealing with talent, dealing with interviewees, lighting. Like you end up doing everything.
Yeah.
How did your early experiences bouncing around with different production companies and on different productions? And I know you told me specifically, actually, I think, the crew that you were out on the Wonderlist with there's only like 4 of you.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
And lighting, audio, 2 cameras. Bill was there too. Like
yeah, Bill's hoofing all the gear with us.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's because the margins are so small, right? Like traveling the world isn't cheap.
Yeah. Tell me about it.
You know better than anyone.
Yeah.
But I think technology has really aided us, and I think I definitely came up in a time when technology made things a lot more democratic. I was a producer at the time, like 10, 15 years ago, but I was also, a photographer and a shooter. So big networks, when I was working at ABC News, they saw an opportunity. They were one of the first networks to start utilizing shooter producers who could produce and shoot. And then some people edited too. I can edit, but I'm very slow at it, so I prefer to put that on someone else.
Yeah.
But that's how you save money. And that's when they're, sadly, that's also when they're kind of like breaking up the unions and the specialized people who were dedicated shooters for ABC News,
Yeah.
right? And that's the process that's played out. They're buying out just the desk producers. A lot of older people got bought out and lost their jobs. But look, you got to adapt or die sometimes too if you don't have like labor protections.
And labor protections versus technology developments, like there's no way you're winning. Like I remember I started working for the New York Times as a photographer in China. I want to say like 2004, and my first few assignments were on film.
Wow.
Yeah, because
the last vestiges.
The last vestiges, yeah, because we just didn't believe that, and the cards were so small, and the files were so small, and the quality was so bad in the early like days when you had Sony's and Canon and Nikon maybe or something like that.
Yeah.
And I remember like my first bunch of shoots for the New York Times were all on film, and you had to go out into the field, shoot, come back, develop, scan, edit,
Wow.
and then deliver. And they would give you like 4 or 5 days to finish a story and then run it for print. And then
what a luxury.
Yeah. And then like 3-4 years later, you're shooting in the field and they want pictures the same day.
Yeah, using a sat phone to upload, the images you edited on your phone or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's crazy. It's crazy. I remember when I stopped working in journalism. I remember the exact moment. Another newspaper that I won't mention, they wanted me to fly from Shanghai to Chengdu, 3-hour flight, then meet their driver, go 2 hours to some village, take a portrait, do some shots of the story that had already been written, and then back 2 hours, and then back to Shanghai 3 hours. And they told me they didn't have a budget for me to stay at the Holiday Inn at the Chengdu hotel for $50 a night. And I was just like, and that was when I started making TV, because my journalism career was finished. And this was after like 2008, 2009, 2010. That was when it all just fell apart, because then everything went online and there was no ad sales. And then, the salaries went from being a couple $100 a day to being nothing. Yeah.
I mean, but also this is the beast they create, right? So like, because coming up, you have to learn how to do everything. As I mentioned, like I was shooting and producing, and later on when we're making the Wonderlist, we're producing in field and directing in the edit room and in the field as well, but also like doing lighting, running audio, running a production, hiring a team, and just like learning that workflow. And that's what all those skills I learned there. And then with HBO, working with Mark Levin, seeing like, that was an aha moment for me, because like all the stuff I learned making the shows and pilots for the networks, I started working with Mark Levin, who's been working in the field for 30, 40 years, right? Like he's like one of the most established documentary filmmakers around, and we have the same process. That's how this is a foolproof thing. This works. And then that's what I later took to my company, the smoking section, and the smaller projects we did. We scaled that up, and then when we made Man on the Run, thankfully I have so much experience internationally that I accrued working for these giant networks. But then I can just kind of adapt that to our model, to a smaller production company, and make that happen. And having the familiarity working with production companies in foreign countries, and knowing the minefields you have to navigate, getting permits or government permission to go places, talk to sensitive people about sensitive subjects. Those things all come in handy. So you can't just expect, the river to flow forever. And I think in this business, you always have to kind of look out for yourself and what your future is going to be, as opposed to whoever you're working for at any given moment.
I think that's very well said, because I really feel like I wouldn't call it like a 10-year itch, but every 10 years my entire career changes. Like always creative and always in storytelling, but changes. So like I went to China, I was writing, I was a photographer, and then 10 years later, that whole being able to make a living from that without doing corporate work or fashion was impossible. And I love documentary, and I love telling real stories about real people. So that was always my passion. And then that basically became it. And that whole crop of photojournalists, documentary photographers that I grew up with in the early 2000s, none of them are really able to make a living from just pure photography anymore. They've all gone into academia, but a lot of them are still, taking sabbaticals and going to Ukraine or to Israel and Gaza and all these things. They're still able to jump in and out.
Yeah.
But no one's like living in the field the way they were in the early 2000s when salaries were great. And then when salaries plummeted, I didn't want to go into academia, and I to be honest, I don't think I was good enough. And then I didn't want to stop traveling and telling stories. So I figured out, like, okay, maybe I can try to make TV. And then that went almost 10 years to the day until COVID.
Yeah.
And then now, coming through COVID, it's like, how do I, how can I create something, and start kind of this next chapter, and where does this next chapter kind of take me? And that's kind of where I am now, is really, every couple years just having to do this big, like, rethink of, like,
reinvention.
I think that's it. Like at the core of it, I think if you're in a storytelling business and you're dealing, with storytelling tools and technology, you're constantly reinventing yourself. Like every time there's these massive changes in technology.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the key is to always just be learning new skills and just learning in general. I think, like, big part of the conversation nowadays is artificial intelligence and how that's going to affect the business. And we're not even at the point where we have to worry about it to the level we will have to, right? So I recommend everyone just brush up on how you can make it work for you.
Yeah.
And because I don't think the human element can ever be eliminated, but there are going to be jobs that are lost.
Yeah.
But if you're able to kind of leverage the technologies that come and familiarize yourself with it and how that can benefit your process, I mean, you'll be better positioned than the people that don't.
So I was chatting with a guy who I'm trying to get on to the show, hopefully next week or the week after, who runs an AI celebrity licensing agency.
Oh boy.
I won't say anything else, but I'm hoping to get him on, because this is such a hot topic.
Yeah.
Because, like, just the other day I was reading, there's this Instagram influencer who makes, like, a couple $100,000 a year peddling stuff on Instagram, and she's not even real. She's AI created.
Yeah.
And people, very pretty and whatever, but not real. And is this AI creation, or the person behind this AI creation, taking money or jobs away from, like, real people?
Of course.
Yeah.
I mean, I had this thought a couple weeks ago, like, are fashion models going to be obsolete? Because I mean, not that anyone has to. I'm not saying we have to cry for
I
the
like to know
models.
they're real. I like to know they're real. I like to know people are real. Damn it!
But if you can just make a computer character who can put on clothes, why would you deal with the human element, right?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of things going to be affected. So you got to be ready.
At some stage, dealing with people is just going to be too problematic.
Yeah, because I mean, especially when and this goes back to what we're talking about with studios and technology companies, right? Like, studios who make films traditionally are all about the human touch, are all about relationships. But tech companies aren't like that. They're about numbers on a spreadsheet. They're about maximizing profits at the expense of the human touch and maximizing efficiency. So the more that technology mindset infects our world, I think the more humanity will suffer.
Yeah. And where do you, I mean, how would you position yourself moving forward? Like, you know, we're on the edge of potentially like computers being able to write scripts or at least screenplays,
Yeah.
or at least, you know, maybe even converting a book into a screenplay and having that be quote unquote like automated. Like that's terrifying. If you were making a living as a writer.
Yeah, and I think that was a big part of what they discussed during the strikes, right?
Yeah.
But artificial intelligence hasn't reached the point where it can create; it just regurgitates the things it processes still, right?
Yeah.
But that's not to say it's not going to happen. So honestly, like the only thing you can do is make sure you're good enough, or invaluable enough, or have enough good ideas that you are more valuable than a computer. And who knows how long that's even possible or feasible. But for me, it's just like it's an ideas business. So hopefully, I can just kind of keep developing my ideas and put them out there, and people like them, and that's really the ultimate test. How that stuff resonates.
Okay, quick back to Men on the Run. So, so how did the Malaysians feel when you were there filming about this massive story that was pretty significantly covered in the U.S. media? Like, I can remember seeing dozens of stories about it 10 years ago, 5 years ago, when all this stuff was happening. And obviously there was a lot of coverage in like the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, et cetera, et cetera. But what was the Malaysian coverage like, and how were you kind of treated going there, and doing a deeper dive into this as a foreigner?
I think there's also a disconnect out there because, as mentioned, Malaysia is kind of what I would classify as like a second world country, right? Like, obviously, there is an educated class, a white collar class, but there's also a lot of people who subsist on wages that I think Americans would be shocked by, right? I think the average salary is like under $20,000 a year, but also a good portion of the population lives on substantially less than that. So a lot of these people, believe it or not, don't even know what 1MDB is, or they don't have the bandwidth to think about it. And you'll see that in the movie because we made an effort to make sure we speak to regular Malaysian people, because obviously we're speaking to politicians, speaking to journalists, we're speaking to kind of the more elite class of people who are involved in the story. So of course they know what's going on, but I was very curious what the average Malaysian person thought of it.
And so the average Malaysian person, maybe, in Kuala Lumpur, for those people who don't know, Kuala Lumpur is the capital of Malaysia, big city, lots of high-rise buildings, quite wealthy, maybe a little bit different than Singapore, but still, pretty powerful. But what was like? Did you get out of KL?
Yeah.
Did you, where did you find your average Malaysians, and what was their kind of feedback?
So most of our time in Malaysia was spent in Penang or KL, and we just made sure to go to all the places where we would have access to just regular Malaysian people, and also utilized our Malaysian production counterparts to speak with just like regular people, like a family, vendors, people on the street, kids, even like anybody, anyone who was willing to talk to us, we would talk to. And the responses run the gamut, like as you might imagine. Some people have never heard of 1MDB. Some people think Jolo is innocent. Some people think Najib Razak, the former prime minister, is innocent. Other people are jaded, and they're just like, this is what always happens and will always happen. So that's just kind of the nature of the beast, though, with any story like this. Like, name something that happens here, and you go out on the street in America, you're probably going to get the same kind of spectrum of responses. Sure. But I think the one thing that resonated most is that there's just a lot of poverty still, right? Like, once you leave KL and the gleaming skyscrapers and towers, there's a lot of people who have to worry too much about day to day, about shelter and food. And when people are reduced to that, things like this are easily perpetrated by those in power who want to stay in power and grab more of the pie for themselves at the expense of the many.
Well, I think that's a great point, and that leads obviously to like a bigger problem of just when tax dollars are separated from the people paying tax, and like you said, people are subsistence living and just worried about getting their kids to school and taking care of their elderly parents. Like, where do they have the bandwidth to follow up on this new sovereign wealth fund and who the key players are and how the money is being invested or misallocated. And I think that that plays to so many, that plays into the plan of so many rich, powerful, elite businessmen and politicians around the world when the populace just doesn't have the time or the energy to do the DD on these investments, and when Congress or Malaysia is it's a democracy, but it's
a new democracy.
It's a new democracy. I like that. It's a democracy, but it does kind of, I guess, have what people would consider like a kind of like a rubber stamp parliament.
Also weak institutions. But I mean, to be fair though, those institutions held the former prime minister accountable and sent him to prison. Now, there's all this scuttlebutt in Malaysia about what kind of prison he's in or whether
back
he's really
dealing
in prison.
Yeah, Mar-a-Lago. Is he in Florida?
I mean, there's huge parallels to America, and I think for us, especially when we're in Malaysia filming, following Najib Razak around, who at that point was out on bail after being convicted of corruption charges, and he's more popular than ever. There are throngs of adoring crowds greeting him at all these campaign stops as we're embedded with him. And you naturally make the association with America and Trump. And they were able to hold Razak accountable. Now, it's a huge open question as to whether that will happen here and how the next year is going to play out. And are we, are our institutions as strong as Malaysia's, or are they not? And I think...
Well, the answer is no, right?
Well, I mean, we'll see.
Yeah.
When I was in Malaysia, and I went to interview Anwar Ibrahim. We had spent about 10 days filming at that point, and I had been following Najib Razak around and seeing this amazing reception he's getting in Penang. Campaign stops for Barisan Nasional, the ruling party.
Were you followed? Were you followed at all in Malaysia? Because I lived in China I was a journalist in China for years, right? Like we were followed all the time.
That was the assumption, and we held all our production meetings outside of our hotel rooms because you have to assume the worst. But I was in a state where I felt rather hopeless about Malaysia's prospects. I met with Najib Razak. We hadn't had the interview yet because they were stringing us along, making sure like they felt comfortable with us. But I had gotten to know him a little bit, so he would feel comfortable with me. I met with some opposition politicians. I met with the journalists involved in the story, and everything I was hearing and seeing put a lot of hopelessness in my heart for the future of Malaysia. But then when I met Anwar Ibrahim, I just saw a man who, despite having been persecuted most of his adult life and having spent 18 years in prison as a political prisoner at the hands of Najib Razak and other former prime ministers, he still had this clarity of purpose and belief in the ability of Malaysians to find a better path forward. And he actually gave me hope on that day, and it kind of changed the tenor of our shoot for the remaining days. And at that point, I still didn't think he would ever be prime minister or that the opposition party would be able to wrest power from Barisan Nasional, which has held power for, I think, 65 of the last 67 years. It's been a single party rule. But while we were in post-production, this guy became prime minister. So never say never. I think things can look hopeless here. And I've definitely felt that way the last few days, I think, just seeing how the new year is developing. But you never know what the world has in store for us.
That's true. That's true. It's interesting about Malaysia too, and it's funny. I think this is quite particular to Malaysia. Is like you do have these like one party systems, where the party just wrestles the finances away from everyone else, and
also
then
democracy
and
name
feeds it.
But I going into this, I had to just actually learn a lot about Malaysia. I had never been to Malaysia before. And one of the things that really surprised me was just how racism is encoded into the Constitution. For those that don't know, I believe 70% of the population is native Malay, right? It's a conservative Muslim country. Then there's 15% Chinese Malay. Because it's a new country, less than 70 years old, these are Chinese immigrants who emigrated to the area 3-4 generations ago. And then there's a smaller population of Indians, and then a bunch of expats. But the Constitution has legal protections for the majority group, the Malays, where they get preferred status for education, bank loans, loan rates,
Wow.
anything you can imagine that the government could possibly be involved in, the majority party gets preferential treatment at the expense of the minorities. So that's one way to hold on to your majority single party rule for 70 years. When the majority of the
Yeah.
population benefits from you being in power.
Yeah, and I think that's just classic vote buying, right? It's just making sure that your
And that happens
base.
too. Vote buying is accepted practice all over the world, I think.
Yeah.
People might not realize that in America, but even here, up until a few decades ago, it was part of the process.
Yeah. I met a guy once that wanted to make a documentary in the United States about the Supreme Court ruling of making corporations,
Oh my God.
able to donate to political parties the same as people or something
Thanks,
like
Hobby
that.
Lobby.
Yeah, and that's crazy. But again, like that was revolutionary here, but everywhere else in the world, that was like par for the course. Like people were going to Asia and learning about how these democracies hold on to power, for so long, these one party systems, and how they feed the machine of government, to keep themselves in it. And then the Americans took bits and pieces from all that and just plugged it in. And
And if you don't think it's on purpose, then you're not paying attention. It's all on purpose.
So on purpose, because that's money makes the world go round. Yeah, that's wild. So back to you. When do you start working on your next project? Are you going to enjoy Friday, January 5th with some friends or family, and then watch the show, and then Saturday morning just start working again? Or if you
I don't know, man. I took the film, I think, between September and November. So we released the film theatrically in London, Ireland, New York, LA, Singapore, and Malaysia. So I spent 2 months touring with the film.
Hold on. Take this back a bit.
Yeah.
So when we first started, you said Netflix global premiere, but you've already released it in theaters all around the world.
Yeah.
How'd that go?
It was great. Limited release, very well received in the UK. 89% Rotten Tomatoes rating.
There you go. So so is that now eligible for award season then because of that?
Yeah, but, I'm not thinking about that stuff. I don't think that's gonna happen. It's a crowded field, and you know how it goes, man. You got to spend a lot of money on lobbying and talk about vote buying. But we are abstaining from that kind of thing. So I'm just excited to have it out there for everybody to see.
Mhm.
One of the main goals we had was making sure people in Malaysia could see it. Right? Like it's about them.
Yeah.
Very excited that the people in Malaysia who have Netflix will be able to see it.
Yeah.
But also very excited for everyone who has Netflix to be able to see it.
Yeah. No, it's amazing. It's for global distribution for such a powerful story. It's the right platform to get out into the world. That's amazing.
But in terms of work, I don't know. I don't even know if I'm going to watch it tomorrow because I've probably seen it like 7,000 times.
There's no one gets it, right? Like, first of all, like, because I actually am in my shows. I hate watching them, and I can't stand my own voice. Like when I hear it come on, I cringe. But you've watched like 100 edits of it, and you've watched the chapters or bits and pieces of it to death. And the last thing you want to do is watch it again.
Plus all the premieres and then all the screenings, and then I did a bunch of Q&As everywhere. So I'm watching it every time. Although sometimes I leave the theater, but I mean the best part of being in the theater is like hearing people's responses to some of the parts that you care about, right? That was the fun part. But also like most of my friends in LA have seen the movie multiple times.
Mm-hmm.
So I would just feel bad doing anything and being like, "Hey guys, want to hang out and watch my movie for the 5th time?" Like, no thanks.
For the 500th time. So when you did your theatrical releases, limited run theatrical releases in key cities around the world, did you take any of that feedback of sitting in those theaters and then make changes to the documentary that is going to be on Netflix?
None whatsoever.
And was that a conscious decision?
It's if something had happened in the story to necessitate that, then certainly we would have opened it back up. But I mean, look, it's a very difficult process to finish a film, and then to open it back up, it's just not worth it financially, unless something happens to necessitate those changes editorially. But I'm confident in the film we have. I'm confident in the film we made, and that's the version that Netflix licensed. And that's the version that will be on the platform January 5th.
January 5th coming to Netflix. So anything else on your mind these days, or should I let you get out to your next? Are you just promoting it for the next couple of days?
Yeah, man, just doing interviews, doing some press, and then in my spare time, I'm just writing some things and developing these other projects and waiting for the world to wake up. I guess the holidays are always a downtime in this business, so as things kind of get back up and percolate, I'll see what's out there for me.
December 15th to January 15th is definitely dead
Oh,
space.
yeah,
Actually,
dead
right up
space.
until after the Oscars, like nothing happens until the Oscars
And then
are kind of
Sundance
done.
starts, and then people start being like,
And
"Oh,
then-
there's new content. Gotta
Yeah.
watch it."
Yeah. So how hard is it in your mind working in this space and finding capital for the projects that you are really passionate about? Like, are people throwing money at you?
I wish.
I wish exactly, but people think like, oh, you've already. Some people watching this might just think like, oh, you already have a check, deposited for your next project. Like where, like I'm just curious, like how much of your this is the exact question I want to ask you. Where are you versus in the fundraising versus the creative process? Like, are you 50-50 when you're kind of in between projects, or you're launching a project like you are now this week? How much of the next few months will be writing, creative process versus fundraising?
I think it's a fluid process, as you know, and I think I'm in a very specialized pocket of time because this thing's landing, and as you mentioned before, like this is my baby. It's not something I'm doing for someone else, so it's almost like forcing me to slow down a little bit because I wanted to hit and make sure that people have a chance to recognize the project and see it, and then understand that like I have a history of doing things on time and under budget. I think that's the most important thing: on time and under budget.
On time and under budget. One more time.
On time and under budget.
Yeah.
But you want to make sure that the people you partner with also have confidence in your ability, but also in your editorial vision. And I think that was the beauty of this project. My partners at Evergreen Media, they believed in the project and gave me free reign to make the film I wanted to make. And once you have that kind of, ability, that's not something you want to let go.
No.
Right. So I think there are definitely parameters to the kind of projects I work on. So we'll see how the next few months, turn out. But obviously, like developing and fundraising, it's part and parcel. You can't escape it. So I'll be trying to do both.
That's quite the juggling act. And yeah, man, it's been great to chat with you. Once again, Man on the Run, January 5th, Netflix global premiere. Cassius Michael Kim.
It's a pleasure, Ryan.
Yeah, and hey, anytime you have something that you want to promote or you just want to catch up and chat about anything, come by, because I don't have enough creative friends in this town yet. So I'm always looking for people to catch up with and just have a chat with. But
thanks, man. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much for your time, and good luck with the premiere.
Thank you.
Hey, we did one. Thanks, man.
That was fun.
Thanks for coming by.
Yes.